Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm coming from the Bosque de Chapultepec in Mexico City, and I'm talking to my friend Zane. This is an experiment because it's quite windy and I have no idea if the microphone will actually pick up our voices or just the wind. Also, my dogs are here and I may have to interrupt this podcast to go catch them. So get ready for a wild ride. So we were going to talk about moving from the US to Mexico and what makes Mexico attractive to Zane. Zane, welcome to the podcast. Please introduce yourself, your pronouns, where you live, what do you do, where you're from, and anything else you would like our listeners to know. Zane is the first person on this podcast who does not have a dog or other pet, so I'm not going to ask you to introduce your pets, but
Okay.
you could introduce the pet you would have if you had one, if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah. My name is Zane. I use he, him pronouns, and I currently have been living in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas. Before that, I've been there for about a year, and before that, I was in Guanajuato for about a year, and before that, Oaxaca for a year and a half. So, yeah, coming up on 4 years in Mexico, which means I might be getting permanent residency in the fall, which will be interesting. And I moved here from the US, from Boulder, Colorado was the last place I lived in the US. And I do software and data engineering work, mostly working with open data related to the US energy system. We have a little all-remote worker co-op that takes that data, cleans it up, and then provides it to the public or to anybody that's working kind of in the public interest on climate and energy issues. That work started while I was in the US, and then it became clear at some point, like, oh, this is a job that you can do from anywhere. And those of us who were living in Boulder doing the work decided to move away and keep doing the work remotely. This was several years before the pandemic started. It was interesting to already be doing all remote work when kind of the world crashed into doing all remote work.
Yeah, let me just briefly pause because the puppy is, yes. Sorry for this brief interruption. I had to go and find the puppy who had wandered off, but we're all back now. So Zane, what was the reason that you moved abroad? Was it just that you realized you could do the work from anywhere? Or was it that your friends, the other members of the co-op were leaving? What made you leave Boulder for Mexico or Guatemala?
I had been involved in a lot of local politics in Boulder, mostly around housing and transportation issues. And it became quite contentious, and Boulder is a pretty expensive place to live, and I was renting, and doing activism work, does not pay very well, if at all. So both the kind of technical work that I was doing was mostly aimed at serving a nonprofit community, and the local kind of politics and advocacy work was completely volunteer. So I ended up feeling economically precarious, and that was fine for a while, but there came a time in 2016 when I had kind of a wave of anxiety over how economically precarious my life was and started questioning, like, am I living the way I am in like a very low consumption way because I want to or because I need to? And that ambiguity stressed me out, and I wanted to feel like I could do the work that I wanted to do without putting myself at financial risk. And the housing politics was very distracting from the climate and energy work that I was doing because it really concerned my housing. And when somebody is trying to take away your housing, which you need to live, it's hard to focus on anything else. The combination of those things, after 8 years of doing that kind of local advocacy work, I felt burned out, I felt economically unstable, and unable to focus on the climate and energy data work that it smelled more like a real job and uses skills and builds skills that are applicable in other real job contexts. And it just felt like I needed to have low expenses and focus on that work that was more economically viable. One way to do that was to move to another country. And I grew up in Central California, in the conservative, rural, agricultural part of Central California, which was overwhelmingly Spanish speaking. The town that I grew up in, something like 70% of households spoke Spanish at home, and both of my parents spoke Spanish, and yet somehow I did not end up learning to speak Spanish. At the time, this didn't really register as a strange outcome, but in retrospect, it became clear that that community was actually very segregated between white people and people of Mexican descent or, migrant farm workers. And that seemed kind of messed up. Looking back at it, I was like, oh, it was a segregated community. And I didn't realize it at the time. And I was kind of cheated out of the opportunity to learn and become fluent in a second language as a child. It feels like, especially in the Western US, everybody should learn both English and Spanish, regardless of your background. There's so many people speaking both of those languages. They've both been there for hundreds of years. Like, there's no good reason why everybody shouldn't just learn both. That had been kind of on my radar for a while as something that I wanted to take care of and explore a little bit more. That came to my mind first when I was doing a bike trip through California in the summer of 2016. So a lot of things kind of came together in the summer of 2016. I biked through Central California to visit my family, and I just noticed that it felt a lot like bike touring in Mexico. The smells and the sounds and the music and the food and the tortillas, and I kind of realized, like, this is part of the same larger place. Like, the US and Mexico are obviously distinct places, but there's a lot of kind of cultural and historical overlap. And if you've spent any time in both places, you see things that exist in both places and kind of threads of culture and society that are obviously intertwined and have roots in both places. I wanted to understand more about Mexico and the place that those threads of my childhood community had come from and become fluent in Spanish. And then I also had this economic pressure to leave the US and a job that would let me work from anywhere. That confluence of things, just it seemed like, oh, I should take advantage of this opportunity and explore Mexico.
Yeah, and was there an inciting event, or were you just one day you woke up and you were like, okay, once this lease is up, I'm moving to Mexico? What was the straw that broke the camel's back? Is that what you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there was kind of a point of resolution in the housing advocacy. We had worked for many years in Boulder, it's illegal to share a house. So unless you are a state-approved nuclear family, you're not allowed to share a house with more than 3 people, which seems kind of messed up to me and to a bunch of other people. And it's much more affordable to share, especially a large house.
And you were sharing with how many people? Or trying to share?
I had lived in houses with up to 15 people, large houses with 10 plus bedrooms. And at the time that I left, I was living in a house with 8 people, organized as housing cooperatives. There are some weird buildings where you can get away with this legally because technically it's 4 units on paper. So, even though there's really one main kitchen, it still, from a legal point of view, looks like a 4-plex with 4 apartments, each of which could have multiple people in it. But there are also just a lot of illegal shared houses where you have as many people as there are bedrooms sharing the house because 1 person per bedroom seems like a reasonable number of people to have in a house.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so we worked for many years to get that law changed, and it became a very contentious kind of knockdown, drag-out fight. And in the end, we kind of fought to a draw, where the law did change, and it did enable the cooperative houses that already existed to continue existing, but just barely. And the administrative burden for being allowed to share a house was very high. It was an application that typically would end up being 50 to 70 pages long, including like architectural drawings of your house, and the application fee was like $1,000. And if you aren't ultimately awarded a license to share the house, then you don't get that money back. So it was just for renters who are typically on a 1-year lease, that's more work and expense than is reasonable to expect people to take on.
Yeah.
So for these houses that had already been exposed through the political process, they were committed and had been involved and were going to use that process to make their living situation legal. But for new rental co-ops, it's just, nobody in their right mind would go through the process. So our house did it. We got the first license. And at that point, I was like, we won, but actually we lost. These rental houses, they're unstable just by nature because you don't have a lot of control over the house itself. Somebody else owns it. Eventually, they get kicked out for one reason or another or fall apart. It just became clear that that style of housing was not really going to be viable longer term. The kinds of people that I wanted to be close to and that I was already close to were ultimately going to be economically exiled from the city. And, I was feeling kind of borderline, like I would maybe eventually be exiled economically, but could also choose to leave. When I had that realization that we kind of lost this battle, I'm probably going to need to leave at some point. And then a co-founder of the worker co-op that I still work for, Christina, was also coming to similar realizations and deciding to leave. Yeah, so we left at the same time for a variety of similar reasons.
And where did you first go, and how did you make that choice?
The first places I went were very much destinations of convenience. They were places that I knew someone and could stay for a few months without really needing to figure things out on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So the first place I went was Switzerland, not notorious for its affordability.
Nope.
But I went with a friend from Boulder, and we did a month-long bike tour camping in Switzerland, which was great. And then I spent 2 months living outside of Zurich in Winterthur with a Swiss friend and her partner who were house sitting for some of the friends that were on a climbing trip in Romania or something. So we had a free apartment outside of Zurich, and I had lived with them in a housing co-op in Boulder in the past,
Mm-hmm.
so that seemed like a totally fine place to land. But it's also part of Fortress Schengen, so I could only stay for 3 months. And then I had another friend who left on a round-the-world bike tour 10 years earlier, but only made it as far as Turkey, where he stopped to study Turkish for a winter before heading into Central Asia. And over that winter, met a Turkish woman and fell in love, and they ended up getting married, so he hasn't left Turkey.
Yeah.
So I went and stayed with them in Antalya on the Mediterranean coast of Turkey for 3 months, and that was another very easy, more affordable, and still interesting place to stay for a little while. And at that point, I felt a little bit more confident in my ability to fend for myself in the world. And I kind of always knew that I wanted to go to Latin America and study Spanish. And obviously those first 2 stops were not part of that journey directly, but they were an easy way for me to get out of Boulder without having a huge hump to get over.
Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning of 2019, I moved to Antigua, Guatemala, where I met Chrissy, and studied Spanish for several months pretty intensively while we had a lull in the grant funding that we were using to do the energy data work, and just, study Spanish for 5 or 6 hours every day for the first 3 months of 2019. And then we got a much bigger grant, and it was time to really work full-time. Spent most of the rest of 2019 in Guatemala, and then moved to Mexico just in time for the pandemic.
Yeah. Did you always know that Mexico was going to be the final destination where you wanted to end up? Or why did you start in Guatemala? What made you start there rather than right in Mexico?
I started in Guatemala because it's a very affordable place to study Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of schools in Antigua and also around Lago Atitlan, and I had previously studied Spanish in Xela, up in the highlands. So it was a place that I had a little bit of familiarity with, and it was a very economical place to study Spanish intensively. So that was the main draw.
Yeah, but you knew you wanted to eventually go to Mexico.
It wasn't like a certainty, but there was definitely the kind of plan of record in my head. Eventually, I want to land in Mexico, spend a significant amount of time in Mexico, and if I'm going to learn Spanish, I want to learn Mexican Spanish. Really, that was the place that I felt most strongly that I wanted to spend time and learn more about and experience firsthand.
So how did you pick Oaxaca just before the pandemic?
How did I pick Oaxaca?
Because Mexico is huge, and there's so many places you could have chosen.
I did not really put a ton of thought into it. It was very much a vibes-based process, and I knew some other people that had spent time in Oaxaca and had loved it, and it was a relatively affordable place even within Mexico. I knew I wanted to be not at the beach, like at a higher elevation where the weather is a little bit more moderate, and somewhere that I would be able to go bike around in the mountains. Oaxaca just checked a lot of boxes, and it was an easy place to land. I got an Airbnb for a month while I found a place to rent, and there was a co-working space in town that I could work from. That seemed like enough to get started.
Yeah.
And it was. I found a little rental place just on Facebook Marketplace elsewhere in the city before my Airbnb was up, and it was very minimal. I certainly did not have any intention of living and working 24/7 in this apartment when I got it initially. It was like a little apartment around a courtyard at a family's house, so it wasn't like a big commercial building or anything, and it was extremely affordable. It was like 3,000 pesos a month. Which at the time was around $125 a month, and that included utilities, which was extremely affordable.
Yeah, just looking at my own rent here in Mexico City, that's wild.
Yeah, even for Mexico, that was affordable.
That's really affordable, and it was a place of your own, and you had, the bed and that was there, right?
The bed was there.
The fridge you bought? Or was there? No, there was a fridge.
The fridge died an early death, and I replaced it. Yeah, I had to buy a gas tank every once in a while, but it was very...
That was really affordable.
Extremely affordable.
Yeah.
And I was still feeling precarious at that point. It was not entirely clear to me that the business was going to continue to function, so I wanted to be very conservative in my expenses. And the family was friendly, and I ended up becoming friends with Leonor, the kind of matriarch of the household. Yeah, and it was still within walking distance of the historic center where the co-working space was. It was a good package altogether for what I was imagining doing, which was really just kind of sleeping there and spending more time being social in the city or working in the co-working space. But as we all know, that's not how things turned out.
Yeah.
I moved in there at the end of December 2019, and
Oh, you're right, right. I visited you there in January, and
that's right.
and we just like COVID was starting to be on the news in China.
Yeah.
But it hadn't made it out of China yet officially, and we were looking at that, and we were like,
And we watched a pandemic movie.
Yes.
What was that movie?
Contagion?
Contagion, yeah. Which was a relatively realistic fictionalization of what it would be like to have a global pandemic. And it wasn't totally off.
Nope.
Although the time scale, I think, felt a little bit off in retrospect. The actual experience of the pandemic felt interminable. It was just like, my God, it is still going. Whereas the movie kind of wrapped things up neatly in a short period.
Because otherwise it would have been a boring movie.
It would have been a hella boring movie. Yeah. Or like 3 seasons of boring television.
Of people sitting in their houses working from home.
Yeah. So, by the end of February 2020, it became clear to me like, this is actually going to be a global disaster. And I just set a deadline for myself of isolating before March 1st. And I went on a bike tour up in the mountains around Oaxaca and then was like, I guess I'm never going back to the co-working space. And then things kind of fell apart. There were times when I didn't leave the apartment for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
That was not what I chose the apartment for. So I ended up having to set up a whole home office and became, unsurprisingly, as many people did, very lonely and isolated. On top of the pandemic isolation, being in a new country and in a new city where I had not yet really had time to make friends and social connections, I think it was extra super isolating.
Yeah.
But I still had my job and I had very low living expenses. So I was like, I should be thankful of this. It could be a far worse situation. I'm just going to grin and bear it and try and get through. But obviously this was not the Mexico experience that I had originally envisioned.
Yeah.
And I still feel like I'm really recovering from that. I got very lonely and depressed and ended up leaving Oaxaca after a year and a half to move to Guanajuato, where Chrissi was living at the time, just to have at least one other person who I knew who was nearby and to experience a different kind of city. Guanajuato is very different from Oaxaca, and continued working from home there. But a lot of social habits that got set up in the first year and a half of being in Mexico have continued to be socially isolating, even as things have pretty much gone back to semblance of normal.
Yeah. I wonder how common that experience is. I feel like in general you're a more social person than I am. You have a harder time being social, but you want more social context than I do. But I have had an easier time going back to just being social.
I think you had an easier time being social before.
Yeah, I think I have an easier time being social and lower social needs.
Yeah, well,
when
so
you
you're
have
doing fine.
Yeah, but your social needs are high.
They're high. I feel like
I think they're higher needs. They're definitely higher than mine.
I feel like my social needs are high, but my maybe social ability is somewhat low. As kids, we were kind of raised in isolation, homeschooled, lived in the country, didn't have ongoing socialization. It sounds like a puppy being raised in isolation might not become well socialized for other dogs or other humans. I feel like I have social need that produces anxiety. I don't want to disappoint people socially, but I also don't always feel like I know how to behave productively in a social context. And if I have the opportunity to socialize, that will often trump other things that I could or should be doing, like work or school. Or I'll have trouble saying no to a social opportunity and will instead just be silent, which is also not an ideal behavior pattern.
Does that mean yes or no?
It means no, but I don't want to say no.
Oh, okay.
It's
okay.
Like
that's good to know. Thank you for letting me know.
It means I need some alone time, or I have something else that I need to do. But it feels somehow very off-putting to tell somebody no. It feels like a strong rejection to me to tell somebody no. Well, I think there's also a dynamic here that of within this context of social need that I felt kind of rejected by Boulder, the place that I had made home for 8 years and had a lot of connections, and was like, I can't stay. I'm not going to be allowed to stay here. I need to leave. And that was isolating. And then spending 3 months here and 3 months there and 9 months in Guatemala in a place with a lot of economic disparity and also a language that I'm in the process of trying to become functional in. Those are all relatively socially isolating experiences. I knew internally I really need to, I have this unsatisfied desire to socialize, which can also lead to socializing that maybe isn't actually what you want to be doing. And that's a thing that I've done in the past. And then realized after the fact, what am I doing? This is not actually what I want to be doing, who I want to be spending time with. And knowing that I was in a state of kind of loneliness and social need made it hard for me to interpret what kind of interactions and relationships am I having with other people. Is it just that I'm desperate, or do I actually enjoy spending time with whoever I'm around?
that can be hard to tell apart in general. Yeah.
Yeah.
Most people just don't think about that question. They don't ask themselves the question, so they don't realize that it's hard to tell apart.
Yeah, and I think I have maybe an almost pathological level of self-reflection, which can get kind of loopy at times.
Anyways, we were in Guanajuato, very different from Oaxaca, very different from any other place I've lived. It has so many stairs and callejones, it's very pedestrian, and then it has these tunnels underneath the city where the cars are. It was an interesting experience, but also I just went back to visit for a few days, because I also left Guanajuato a little bit after you did. And I realized I like visiting it because I have friends there, but I wouldn't choose to live there again. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting, like just as a physical city, I agree. It's an obligatory pedestrian city. The only way to access most of the city is on foot. That was an interesting experience, but it didn't have the same kind of evenly spread activity throughout the city that Oaxaca does, that Mexico City seems to, and that to some degree San Cristobal does. All of the activity in Guanajuato is either at the bottom, where you have some car streets and a bunch of commercial activity and tourist attractions, or at the very top of the city where you have kind of a peripheral road and more kind of local economic activity. And everything in between is just stairs and residential houses.
Unless you have our neighbors, the downstairs people, who tried to have, what was it first?
Oh yeah, there was like an activity space where
that
they were
didn't
doing
really
like
work.
yoga classes or something. There's just no incidental traffic in these stairways.
Yeah, you don't randomly walk past. On their door, they had a sign.
Yeah.
But then they had these drumming workshops all day long.
Yeah, not the quietest place.
It was so loud. My least favorite part was it was so incredibly loud all the time.
Yeah.
And firecrackers, and Game is afraid of firecrackers, and it is the loudest place I've lived in. It's louder than even Guatemala was loud, but this was another level of loud.
And Guanajuato ended up feeling like a party town.
Yeah.
Like a mix of students partying because there's a big university there, and then it seems like a pretty common weekend destination, maybe from Mexico City or other places, local folks to go have a wild weekend.
From the state, I imagine, from all over
Yeah, from
Guanajuato
Leon
State.
or other places nearby. And that wasn't not really like the vibe they're known for. I think I've also realized too that I really do like biking around cities, and that's always been my main form of transportation. And different cities are better or worse for that. Guanajuato was very, very bad for bike, basically impossible. And even getting out to where one could ride a bike is carrying the bike down 8 flights of stairs. So I didn't bike as much. That kind of physical activity is a big part of what keeps me happy. I feel like my bodily experience has been a much more reliable source of happiness historically than what's going on inside my head. And I forget this on a regular basis and then rediscover it by going on lots of long bike rides to get myself out of depression. And then I'm like, how did I forget this again? Why do I have to relearn this lesson so many times? But that was part of why I decided to relocate to San Cristobal. There's a lot of dirt roads that kind of start right at the edge of the city and are relatively bikeable, very low traffic and nice scenery. And you can bike directly from your house instead of having to interact with the stairs.
Yeah.
So that was something that I was looking for. But the city itself is still definitely a pedestrian city. I've biked around San Cristobal and I've walked around San Cristobal. Biking around is more trouble than it's worth. The city is not that big.
Yeah.
The streets are extremely narrow and mostly one way. There's not much exercise to be had because the distances are so small.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have the same kind of enjoyable feeling of flying that you can have in a city where you can just kind of bike continuously for half an hour on the way to some distant location. So most of my biking there has been in the mountains on the weekends. And that's very nice. But it's different from, I just got back from spending most of May in Boulder visiting people and having our first worker co-op retreat where we met each other for the very first time, which was wild.
Well, except for your co-founder.
Yeah, of the 9 people, I had only ever face-to-face met one person, Christina.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting experience to...
Yeah, that is crazy. Unrelated side note, but it felt like things were just starting for Catalyst when we first met.
Yeah.
So I've been vicariously getting a little bit of that experience. Initially, there were 4 people, and you all knew each other.
I think initially when we first met, there was only 3 still.
There was only 3?
Yeah, it was just me and Christina and Steve at that point.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was 4 already.
No, I think we hired Austin when
wasn't there Amy or someone?
There was Elena, but she left very early on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I think when we met there was Elena was still there. Is that possible?
I don't think so. I think that she left much earlier.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you really were just 3 people.
I think it was just 3 people, and now it's
Yeah.
9 people.
Wow,
Yeah.
yeah. So it has grown.
It's a lot.
It has proven to be sustainable.
We'll see if it's sustainable. It's continuing.
I mean, but that's because you always think everything is precarious.
Yes.
Not because it has proven to be precarious.
Most businesses fail, especially most small businesses. So
Yeah.
we will probably fail, but hopefully not. And I continue to be pleasantly surprised that we have not yet failed. So hopefully we'll continue.
I'm assuming, that's an assumption, I have never looked into this, that most small businesses fail within their first year of existence.
I think it probably varies wildly between different types of businesses. Like most restaurants fail within a year.
Yeah. I think that's where this idea comes from that I have, because I see them opening up and then closing down within months.
Yeah. If you don't make it quickly, I think you shut down
because you're
pretty
constantly paying rent and for the place, for example. And
so that's one nice thing about our business is almost our only expense is labor. So we pay ourselves. There was a time when we did work without paying ourselves because we were kind of investing sweat equity in the business and thought that there was a possibility of getting paid in the future, which turns out to have been true.
Yeah.
So it was worth the early time in Guatemala when we didn't really have revenue continuing to do the work because eventually it worked out. But what I was saying is in Boulder for the last 3 weeks that I was there, I did a lot of biking around. I borrowed a bike from the friends that I was staying with. I'm very familiar with the city, so kind of had another reminder of what it's like to bike around in the city. It was very pleasant.
Yeah.
I really do enjoy that way of getting around a city, learning about the city, exploring the city. So I'm interested in finding a way to do that in Mexico. And I think that that probably means not living in a small colonial capital.
I don't remember. Is San Cristobal also cobblestone streets?
They're not really cobblestone, but they aren't smooth asphalt streets. It's the fake cobblestone.
Yeah.
And then there are some actual cobble streets. They're very narrow. They're mostly one way. They were designed for pedestrians and horses 400 or 500 years ago, and that's not a conducive city form for biking.
Yeah, it is for me because my favorite way of exploring cities and getting from point A to point B is walking.
Yeah, it's a great walking city.
It's perfect for that.
Yeah.
And so is Guanajuato because the stairs don't really matter when you're walking. They do matter when you have to carry your bike up and down the stairs. Yeah. What turned me off Guanajuato was the noise level, which is partly related to the location, and also the fact that it got much warmer than I expected it to. And then there are no trees. I like hiking. Ideally, I walk for 1 to 3 hours every day. Ideally, in green spaces or spaces that feel green. Mexico City has that. And in Guanajuato, even getting out of the city, like at this one time when I got back from Austria and I had no electricity and there were lots of, what's the name for the little disgusting things in my freezer?
Maggots?
Maggots in my freezer because I had left frozen bones for the dogs or something in the freezer. Anyways, that was a depressing time. That was one of my most depressing times. I forced myself to get up in the morning before it got hot and walk out of the city and walk up to El Cerro de la Cruz. And I did that every morning. It was like 3 hours. It worked, as it always does, even though it's hard, because I know that I have learned that lesson.
Yeah.
And I do remember it. Sometimes I remember it and it's hard to actually do it, even though I know. But at that point, I did remember it and I forced myself to do it because I knew otherwise, I don't know. Yeah, like I had to. But the mountains, they're like cacti. They're exposed. When I was walking up the mountain, it was still okay because it was early in the morning. But by the time I was walking back down, the sun was so hot and there's no shade. I have a condition where my feet blister really easily. At some point, I was just done with that. I wanted to be somewhere where there were more trees.
Yeah, this is another part of my desire to move to San Cristobal. The Bajío, that area where Guanajuato is kind of scrubby. The mountains are very pretty, and in the cooler seasons, it was...
In the cooler seasons,
there were some amazing hikes around there, and some decent bike rides, but it's not lush in the same way that southern Mexico is.
I didn't realize that I liked that lushness so much. I think that's part of the reason I liked Guatemala and Finca El Pilar so much, because it was so lush.
Yeah, Finca El Pilar was somewhere between cloud forest and rainforest. It was like bromeliads and epiphytes everywhere.
That was amazing. And anyways, going from Guanajuato to Mexico State and exploring around there and south of Mexico City, it's like, whoa, trees! This is so cool. I love it here. I did end up in Mexico City instead of outside of Mexico. But even Mexico City has trees, like the Bosque de
Chapultepec.
Chapultepec. I don't know why I can never say that word. It's great and it's very walkable.
It is,
Yeah.
I mean, I've only been here for a couple of days, but it is, compared to U.S. cities, shockingly green. There are so many trees on so many streets. And looking at the map, looking at Google Maps, there are these big boulevards, and the picture I had in mind looking at these streets on the map was like, oh, this is going to be some huge 6 or 8 lane, almost freeway-like street. It's going to be miserable. But then you get to them, and most of them have an enormous median in the middle with trees on it and trees on both sides. And maybe it's a mix of car traffic and bike traffic and bus rapid transit line. They're still quite busy, but in a much, much more pleasant and inviting way than a street of the same size would be in the U.S.
Yeah.
I got very distracted yesterday evening and ended up walking around for 5 hours, just exploring a bunch of the city, and that was very easy to do.
Yeah. You said you were leaving the co-working space, and I was heading out with the dogs, and I said, I'm going to be at this park for a while, so if you want to meander past there. At some point I went home, and then at some point I had dinner, and at some point I was getting ready to go to bed, and and the co-working space that you left is not that far.
Definitely not that far.
But it took you 5 hours.
Well, I mean, the co-working space is a 20-minute walk from your
Yeah.
house, not a 5-hour walk. So I think that's just indicative of a good city.
Oh, yeah.
You can keep walking, and it can continue to be engaging and interesting for hours at a time. In a way, that means that the distances shrink because, as you were saying, our perception of time is incredibly subjective. And if interesting things keep happening, it doesn't feel like a lot of time is passing. Yeah. And walking around many parts of Mexico City, there's just always a new interesting thing happening, and a new street with a interesting garden in the median, or a bunch of street food vendors, or a park where people are rollerblading and engaging in lightsaber duels. It's just like always something to watch and be engaged by.
Yeah.
And it makes it feel like the distances are not as large as they are. And also the distances are not that large.
Yeah.
I lived in Los Angeles in the US for more than a decade. Los Angeles is more than 150 kilometers across. It's completely inaccessible as a pedestrian. But Mexico City, they're comparably gigantic metro areas in terms of population. You could definitely bike across Mexico City in a day. You can even walk across a pretty big chunk of it in a day.
Did you look up how many kilometers it is across?
I haven't really measured it because I don't have internet back at your place. But it's on the order of 20 or 30 kilometers to get across the kind of the core of the city.
That's such a big difference. I did not expect that I would like Mexico City that much. And the same thing happened to me. Everyone I know at this point in the city is within an hour's walking distance from where I live. And that feels like they're all just around the corner, because walking for an hour feels so short. It's so nice and walkable because there will be several parks that I will cross through on the way. Then I'll stop somewhere for orange juice from a street
There's
juice
always
vendor.
like, you're not going to go hungry even on a 5-hour walk. You're like, I'm going to get some tacos. I'm going to get a churro. I'm going to get some fruit.
Exactly. And at the end of my walk, there will be a friend and a tired dog, because my dogs are coming with me. So it's perfect. And then after the dogs have slept through me hanging out with my friends, they are full of energy again, and we take the same walk back home. And I've got my 2 hours of walking covered, and it just feels, a lot of it feels very green.
Yeah, certainly if you want to
if you
cross the city and be in green space,
you can.
You can.
Yeah.
And like you could also not if you get off in this part of the city that's less tree lined. But once you're familiar with what places are green, where the parks are, where the boulevards are, you could almost entirely get around in those lush corridors.
Yeah, which is, as you mentioned yesterday, so different from the picture people tend to have of Mexico City as this big, polluted megalopolis. It does not feel that way to me.
Yeah, so this is actually a setup for a lot of change in Mexico City, which some locals are not entirely thrilled about, right? I mean, Mexico is incredibly generous with its residency, unlike the United States, especially during the pandemic. A ton of people were like, oh, I'm going to go to Mexico. The rules are less strict there, and my gosh, it's affordable, and my gosh, this huge city is amazing. And I think over the last 3 years or so, there's been a big boom in especially younger people moving to Mexico from the US and discovering that actually it's an amazing country with some amazing cities, and a lot more people can just do remote work kind of forever now. Yeah,
the pandemic kind of forced technology and employers to make that
that
possible.
accommodation. Like we realized, like, oh, this is the thing we could have been doing, but now we have to do it. And I really think there's no going back on that. Like a lot of jobs are just going to stay remote. That can be awesome. And one thing that means is people in Mexico or in Guatemala that know how to do the jobs that people need done can also access those jobs.
Yeah.
But it also means you're going to get a lot of U.S. people or people coming from the more privileged countries reducing their living expenses by living in a more affordable country and having economic impacts of a variety of types on those cities and countries.
Yeah, this is something that is on my mind regularly. When I get the opportunity to ask, I ask people what they think about that. Mexicans. The last time I asked an Uber driver, because that Uber driver was so talkative and it was a longer ride. It turned out that they were driving for, I think, 11 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Oh.
I thought, wow, that's crazy. That's a lot. Some of that is probably spent just waiting for a ride to show up, but still, like, you're sitting in your car for that long every day. They were apparently happy with that job. They enjoyed it. They thought that was normal and great, and with that, they could live a decent life. Then I compared it with myself. I don't work 11 hours a day. I don't think I would be capable of that mentally.
Mexicans work a lot. Mexicans work some of the most hours per week of any country in the world. I remember seeing the average is 50 or 53 hours a week, which is nuts, especially compared to a country like Germany. Germany is
40 hours or 38.
Well, it's much less than that because people get 6 weeks off and they get paid maternity leave. And they get, so I think Germany, it's more like on average over the year, 27 or 30 hours a week.
Yeah.
Once you account for all of the time that you're not working. Compared to
That's right.
More than 50 hours a week in Mexico on average, which means there are a bunch of people that are working substantially more than 50 hours a week in Mexico. I definitely feel like I'm cheating.
Yeah, I am cheating. I'm 100% cheating. I'm working way less than that, and my lifestyle is probably the same or higher as that Uber driver's lifestyle. I don't know because I don't know where that Uber driver lives or how, but yeah.
I'm very interested to see how this plays out, especially in Mexico City, which is really a world-class city with anything you could possibly want to find in a city. But compared to living in Paris or Tokyo or New York, any other major world city, it's still incredibly affordable.
Yeah, especially if you're spending pesos but you're earning dollars. Right? And me too.
So how will Mexico City accommodate this influx? Will it clamp down on it eventually, or will it allow change to happen? What kind of change will it allow to happen? Will you end up with just a Gringolandia core where Mexican people basically can't live unless they come from a very rich background, and then you get a wave of economic development of some kind that spreads out from that and change that kind of propagates out across the city? Will they build a bunch more housing, or will they just let housing be a scarce good that gets more and more expensive? The U.S. has been incredibly bad about allowing prosperous cities to grow and change.
Yeah.
I hope that Mexico doesn't do that and can get positive change out of this as well that is good for locals and allows interesting national change to happen.
I feel like if they do things well, then the advantage that we're currently exploiting will have to go away.
Yeah, it does not seem stable.
It's clearly unfair. I'm currently not paying taxes anywhere.
Yeah.
And my income is much higher than that of the average Mexican.
Yeah.
That's so unfair.
Yeah.
And I could just move here while immigrating to the European Union would be super hard.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like I could just, quote unquote, move here. I could move here because COVID happened and Mexico was very nice and was like, oh, well, if someone is here and doesn't want to travel during COVID, you can apply for a residency. That's how I got residency because I don't meet the minimum income requirements for temporal residency. That's with that special law, you didn't have to show any income requirements. You just had to write a nice letter and say, I'm afraid to travel because COVID, and they just gave me temporal residency. Isn't that lovely? Austria
it's amazing.
or the European Union would never do that. As long as it's a one-way street, it's not going to be fair.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that seems like a very durable feature of the world that we live in.
Yeah.
I felt more weird about it early on because the kind of temporary residency that I got is rentista, which means you're living off of your investments. I didn't have a particularly large collection of savings when I first moved to Mexico, but they basically just want to look at your bank statement, and if there's enough money in it, and there's been enough money in it for the last year, you're welcome to move to Mexico.
Yeah.
Or if you have a pension. If you're on Social Security and you can show like this is how much I'm getting every month, that meets some threshold, and they're like, welcome to Mexico. Come live here and spend your Social Security checks in Mexico.
And they don't explicitly say, you can work for a U.S. company or you can't. I don't think that is explicitly stated. I think it is assumed that you're living off of your savings, right? If you get that rentista,
you're qualifying for residency based on the savings.
The money that you already have, not the money that you're going to make while you're here.
Right. So they don't want to see like how much you're earning per month. But you're definitely allowed to work for a foreign company.
You are? Yeah.
Yeah. Under the rentista visa, you can't work for a Mexican company. You don't have work permit in the country. And technically, if you're working for an overseas company but living in Mexico, you're supposed to pay Mexican income taxes. But the immigration rules are also set up to encourage people to live in Mexico and live off of an income that's coming from outside the country, whether that's your pension or external job. So they have two competing imperatives with the rules. We want foreigners to live here and spend their money here, and we also want people to pay income tax, but they've chosen to be pretty selective in the way the income tax rules are applied. So if you have a Mexican job, whether you're a Mexican person or a U.S. person, you need to pay Mexican income taxes, unsurprisingly, because that's an official job. But in this big gray area where there's no obvious reporting of your income to the Mexican tax authorities, I have yet to meet a single person that is paying the taxes that they in theory owe. And I even asked the guy at the consulate, hey, what do I do with my foreign income? And he just waved me off like, oh yeah, no, you don't need to report that. It's fine. Yeah, like I've done further exploration with the CPA since then, and that is not actually on paper what you're supposed to do, but it is what everybody does. And I think if they enforce the actual progressive Mexican income tax brackets on foreign workers, people would choose not to work here. They would choose to be here temporarily, or they'd move around to different countries, or they'd live in another country that is still being lax.
You would lose 40% to taxes if that was actually being enforced on foreigners. That's a substantial amount, so you would think twice.
Yeah. I think this new regime of geography meaning much less than it did previously, and so many of our rules and laws being tied to where you are, it's kind of a mess right now. And I don't know how long it's going to take for that mess to work its way out. This mess has existed for the wealthy for a very long time, engaging in all kinds of arbitrage to avoid taxes and form companies in the most advantageous places. And
I feel like I'm doing the same thing on a small scale. Yeah. It's easy to do.
It's just been opened up to lower income people in a way that it wasn't before by virtue of remote work and the pandemic normalizing that. And it's been messed up for a long time for rich people. Like maybe they're not going to fix it.
Yeah, it is messed up, and I recognize that I am part of that problem. Because I am exploiting that advantage. It will disappear at some point. I'm sure it will in some way, especially as more and more people discover that they can do that.
Will it disappear or will it move?
Something is going to change because the setup here is so clearly unfair. The lack of enforcement is so unfair.
I'm not sure. I think it should change. And coming from the US or from Austria, we're less likely to envision a world in which the rules just never get enforced, or some of the rules never get enforced, or they're very selectively enforced. But I kind of have a feeling that a lot of the world, that has been how it is for a very long time. There's more gray area, there's more flexibility, it's actually not particularly fair. I don't know that that's literally unsustainable.
No, you're right. For example, I have a car currently, and I do not own that car because I can't own it because I don't have a taxpayer number. But I found a way around it. Where there's a will, there's a way. If you are from the European Union or the US, it's not always if there's a will, there's a way. But if you come from a privileged background, there usually is.
And sometimes it's just that doing the official thing is so hard. You're like, I'm trying to follow the rules.
I tried to get a tax-paying number here, and I just gave up.
So I don't know. And a lot of what I like about Mexico City, because I'm kind of a transportation and land use nerd, I've just been floored by the level of transit service here and how affordable it is. The bus rapid transit, the metro, the city bike share system, these boulevards. Obviously, these are all being maintained at some level with public funds. And they're great. I want them to be maintained. I want them to be affordable.
So like those are taxes you wouldn't mind paying.
I would be happy. I would be super happy to pay those taxes. But are those things funded by income tax or sales tax or the value-added tax? I would like to know more about how does this city actually work? How does it function? And am I contributing to that in a productive way, or am I just completely cheating on every level?
Oh yeah, you'll find out because I know you will, and tell me when you do. Because I want to know, but I'm not nerdy enough to actually find it out because that will require some digging. Since we talked about living in Mexico. So you currently have an apartment in San Cristobal. You're currently visiting Mexico City. What's your plan moving forward? Do you see yourself going back to San Cristobal and staying there longer term?
I purposely got a flight back from Colorado just to Mexico City and not all the way back to Chiapas because I wanted to spend a little bit of time exploring other possible locations, Mexico City being one of them. I'm hoping to spend a couple of weeks in Orizaba and Veracruz as well on the way back to Chiapas. I think I'm probably going to move. I think I'm going to pick a place after doing a tiny bit of exploration and go spend a year in that place. I'm committed to sticking around in Mexico at least through the end of the year because that's when I would become eligible for permanent residency and trying to get that. And after that, I don't know what I'm going to do. I could definitely imagine moving to Mexico City and spending a year here, assuming I permanent residency, and yeah, I don't know. It feels both unfair and like an incredible privilege and opportunity. I could always go live in Mexico. That Mexico is that generous and welcoming with its residency that's just a thing that I could always have. Or I could even, after a year of permanent residency, get Mexican citizenship.
After only 1 year?
Yeah, after only 1 year of permanent residency, you can apply for a Mexican passport. Maybe that is the thing that I want to do. I don't know. I haven't felt like a very strong impulse to move back to the U.S. I don't really have a place that feels like home anywhere, including the U.S. So maybe I'll move back, but I can definitely see having the option of living in Mexico in the future being something that I would very much like to preserve. And
even if you do move back.
Yeah,
I agree.
And I wish that this were a reciprocal arrangement.
Yeah.
It's very broken the way it is.
Agreed. One last question in relation to moving places, having a nomadic life, and you've had a nomadic life for the last couple of years, and I have too. Would you like to find a place that feels like home, where you want to stay? Or do you see yourself being a permanent nomad with no place that is home?
I would definitely like to have at least one place that feels like where I have people and organizations that I'm familiar with, a physical city that I'm familiar with. That's definitely something that I want a feeling of and belonging, and I've struggled with that in a couple of different ways in the U.S. and now a couple of different ways in places that are not the U.S. I can imagine even having two places that feel like home and being able to move back and forth between them on some time scale.
Yeah.
But yeah, one would be great.
What would make a place feel like home for you?
For me, it's having a network of people that are connected to me, but also to each other. Having a relatively densely connected social network of people who do things together, have some shared values, maybe work on projects together, whether those are political or construction or joint effort within a community of people that share some values. That's the main thing that feels like home to me.
And it needs to be in the same physical space, because you have that with Catalyst, with the coop.
It's just very different in a physical space. I want to be able to have incidental interactions with people, see them at the market, or just call them up and ask to go on a bike ride, or let's have a picnic in the park, and be able to do things without a lot of planning, and yes, do things in 3 dimensions in real life.
Yeah.
I've had enough of the 2-dimensional screen life for a very long time at this point.
I feel like everyone who works at a computer, or at least I would like my spare time to be in 3D. Yeah. So the co-op in Boulder used to feel like that.
The housing co-op?
Yeah. Was that home?
The housing co-op community felt like home in Boulder. Yeah, for sure. There was like more than 100 people living in various housing co-ops. We created a food co-op to buy bulk food for all the housing co-ops. We had nighttime bike rides in the summer to go out to some lake and go skinny dipping. There were house concerts where you would find some acoustic band and have them over and have a giant potluck. Yeah, there were lots of community events and people interact. In the end, it ended up feeling economically unstable because most of the people in that community are renting, and home prices in Boulder have tripled since then, and it's just an exclusive place.
Yeah.
I would like to have that kind of feeling with more long-term durability.
Yeah, I do hope you find it. I think it is out there somewhere, or can be created, but I think it has to be already out there.
I hope so.
You just have to stumble across it. Well, on that note, I'm getting hungry, so I think we should get a torta, or at least I will get a torta. You might get tacos.
Yeah, we should go find some food.
Thank you for coming on the podcast and talking with me and hanging out with the dogs at Chapultepec. See, I can say the word. I don't know why that's such a tongue twister to me.
Yeah.
One more thing. If people want to get in touch with you, if people want to get involved in climate or energy data activism, or are looking to work for a co-op and are technically skilled, where can they find out more about you or get in touch?
You can find Catalyst at catalyst.coop. That's our website. You can also find us on GitHub, where we coordinate most of our work, and the organization is just called Catalyst Cooperative. I am at Zane Selvins at social.coop on Mastodon. That's the main social media that I use these days. I'm the only Zane Selvins on Earth, as far as I know, so if you just search me, you'll find me.
Perfect. Send me all the links you want me to put into the show notes.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.